17, reading verses 41 to 50. And I'm reading from the New American Standard Bible, the Open Bible Edition. Then the Philistine came on and approached David with a shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy, with a handsome appearance. And the Philistine said to David, "Am I a dog that you come to me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine also said to David, "Come to me, and I will give your flesh to the birds of the sky and the beasts of the field." Then David said to the Philistine, "You come to me with a sword, a spear, and a javelin, but I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have taunted. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hands, and I will strike you down and remove your head from you. And I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky and the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know that there is a God of Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord does not deliver by sword or by spear, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hands." Then it happened when the Philistine rose and came to draw near to meet David, that David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet the Philistine. And David put his hand into his bag and took from it a stone and slung it and struck the Philistine on his forehead. And the stone sank into his forehead so that he fell to the face of the ground. Thus David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. The word of God for the people of God.
Thanks be to God.
So one day in Sunday school, a teacher was telling the story of David and Goliath. The teacher embellished the story and used all sorts of hand gestures and movements to bring the story to life. The teacher told the children of David's great faith and concluded the story by telling the students how David killed Goliath with a rock and a sling. When the teacher had finished, she asked, "What lesson do we learn from this story?" And a boy raised his hand and said, "Duck." Duck. Maybe Goliath should have taken that into consideration. Let us pray. Lord, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. So for this month of July, I'm going to do a little short series on the superheroes of the Old Testament. We'll look at Daniel and his friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and we'll also look at the story of Samson and Delilah. Today, though, we start with the showdown between David and Goliath. Now, to start this, to look in the series, or to look at this story, is to begin back in Samuel, the very beginning of the first book. And we see there that the people of Israel want a king. And they want to be like all the other nations. And Samuel, who is a prophet and a judge, is quite upset and takes it quite offensively that they would want a king. And God says to Samuel, "Hey, it's not you they're rejecting, it's me. So go to the people and tell them this is what's going to happen if they get a king." Well, essentially, God sent Samuel back with the word that was pretty much, be careful what you wish for. Well, they still want a king. They want to be like everybody else. And so God says, okay, I'll give you a king. And we get Saul, who is the first king of Israel. Now, Saul was a pretty good king when he first started out, but then he kind of stumbled. While engaging an enemy at Gilgal, Saul's men became disheartened and afraid and began to desert, and Samuel, who was essentially the army chaplain, was delayed in coming. So Saul felt it was necessary to take on Samuel's role and offer sacrifices. This was an offense to God, and so God removed the spirit from Saul. Well, now it was time to find a new king, though Saul will continue to be king for several years. God sends Samuel to the house of Jesse. And Jesse has 8 sons, and so one by one Samuel interviews these sons. And they are quite handsome and strong, and Samuel thinks these are pretty good guys. But God says, no, not that one, not that one, not that one. You know, Samuel, I don't judge by outward appearances. I look at the heart. And so finally we get down to the 8th son, David. David has been out shepherding for his father and comes home, and Samuel meets him, and God says he's the one. And so Samuel anoints David future king of Israel. Now it'll be some time before David actually sits upon the throne, and during those years he and Saul cross paths. At one juncture, David is in the house of Saul there playing the harp. And so he's living under Saul's roof, and other times Saul wants David dead because he's afraid that David will take his position. In today's story, Saul is really glad to see young David come along. There's a battle underway in the Elah Valley, and there are 2 armies amassed. One on the top of each hill and a valley in between them. The Philistines are on one side and the Israelite army is on the other. And there's a Philistine superhero who is there, who stands head and shoulders above the rest. His description is impressive. He's over 9 feet tall, wearing a bronze helmet and bronze armor to protect his chest and legs that weighs about 125 pounds. He also carried a bronze sword strapped to his back. You can imagine with all that bronze what he looked like when the sun was shining on him. His spear was enormous, about 25 pounds. He was big and bad and boisterous and boastful. He was cocky. He shouted across the valley at the Israelite army, "Choose your very best to come out and fight. If I win, then my people will enslave your people. But if one of your soldiers wins, then my people will serve your people." Well, Saul and his men are terrified. But for 40 days, every single day, Goliath taunts the army of Israel. And for 40 days, not one man can be found who will take on Goliath. They're terrified and paralyzed with fear. So King Saul decides to offer an incentive. He says, to the man who will kill Goliath, I will give you lots of money. I will give you my daughter in marriage, and you and your family will have tax-free for the rest of your life. Pretty good deal. No go. It's kind of like the rich man who had a rather unattractive daughter. In an attempt to get her married, he invited 100 of the finest-looking young men to come to his mansion. He made them an offer. You see this swimming pool? It's filled with alligators. To any of the young men here willing to jump in and swim successfully from one end to the other, I will give them their own mansion, $1 million in income annually, and my daughter in marriage. Well, they were all pumped up until the man mentioned his daughter. Nobody moved. Minutes passed until suddenly there was a big splash, and in lightning speed a man swam successfully from one side of the pool to the other. The rich man came to him and said, "Well done. I suppose you'd like my daughter." And the young man said, "No way." And the rich man said, "Then I suppose you want your mansion." "No, don't want that either." "Then you want the money?" "No, sir. Don't even want that. Then what do you want? I want to know the name of the guy who pushed me in. Nobody was pushing anybody into this fight with Goliath. Even with this incentive, no one stepped up until David comes along. Among the king's army were Jesse's 3 eldest sons, and Jesse had sent David with provisions for his brothers and also asked David to check on their well-being. So when David arrives, he leaves the provisions with the supply clerk and heads to the battle line to check on his brothers. It's while he's there that he hears Goliath shouting his usual taunt, and David is incensed. David goes to King Saul and said, "This Philistine shouldn't turn us into cowards. I'll go and fight. Why does he think, who does he think he is anyway, that he should defy the armies of the living God?" Saul's response was essentially this: David, you're a boy, and Goliath's been a soldier all his life. And David says, well, here's my resume. You know, David was no weakling. He was a shepherd, and he was probably quite buff. And David says to Saul, you know, to protect the sheep, I've had to go against lions and bears. I have killed them both, and I certainly can take care of this worthless Philistine. He should never have made fun of the army of the living God. And as the Lord rescued me before, the Lord will keep me safe now. So Saul says, okay, the Lord be with you. And so, it's funny, he would be with David, but he wasn't willing to go himself. So Saul then puts his armor on David. And I can kind of try to imagine this. You know, David's the shepherd kid, you know, young man. And he's got this armor on now, kind of like this. And it's cumbersome. He even says so. He said, this isn't me. So he takes it off, and he takes his sling and his 5 smooth stones. And now it's time to rumble. This had to be anticlimactic for Goliath. He had waited 40 days for someone to take him on, and this was the best the Israelites had to offer. A mere boy with a sling. But looks are deceiving. Goliath makes fun of David. He says, do you think I'm a dog? Is that why you come at me with a stick? And then he curses David in the name of the Philistine gods and shouts, come on, when I'm finished with you, I'll feed you to the birds and the wild animals. But David answers back, you've come out to fight me with a sword and a spear and a dagger. But I come out to fight you in the name of the Lord all-powerful. He is the God of Israel's army, and you have insulted him too. Today, the Lord will help me defeat you. The Lord always wins his battles, and he will help me defeat you. So Goliath starts forward, David runs, he puts the rock in his sling, and we all know how this story goes. He swings that thing around and around and around and lets it go, and plunk. It goes into Goliath's head, and Goliath is down. David defeated Goliath with a sling and a rock, and he didn't even use a sword. You know, it's a fun and larger-than-life story. And even if you're not a church person, most people have heard of the story of David and Goliath. And like many of the biblical heroes and heroines, David was faced with what seemed like an impossible situation. We see it with Moses when he's caught between Pharaoh and the Red Sea, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and they are faced with the fiery furnace, and Esther, who's faced with the annihilation of her people. Each and many others are faced with their own giants, and we can learn from them when we come up against our own. Though ours might not be some 9-foot-tall dude, our giants are still big. It can be financial problems, health issues, marriages, work time, wayward children. So many things that can seem so daunting, challenges that are bigger than we can handle. And those challenges will distract and drain us and deter us from doing those things that God intends for us and living the life that is the Israelites spent 40 days frozen in fear. We can't grow in the Christian life and in Christian character unless we stand up against the giants. Maybe you're facing one now. So let's see what David teaches us about those giants. And we begin with the question, and this is the big question. What are you focusing on? You see, King Saul and the Israelites were focused on the giant. They were focused on Goliath. Verse 11, chapter 17 tells us that Saul and his army were dismayed and terrified at hearing Goliath's taunt. Verse 24 tells us that they ran from Goliath in great fear. And verse 33, after David volunteers to fight, Saul says, "You're not able to go out against the Philistine and fight him because you're just a boy." And he's been a fighting man all his life. All Saul and the army could see was a big honking giant. But that's not what David saw. It is not what David focused on. His focus was solely on God, and in three ways. First of all, when Saul told David he was too young to fight, what does David do? David responds by sharing his personal experiences and his past experiences of God. He shares how, yes, I may be a boy, but I was a shepherd, and I've cared for the flocks of my father, and God has helped me defeat the lions and the bears in the past. God delivered me before, and God will deliver me again. You know, it's huge. When you read through the Old Testament, it's really interesting that there will be this big victory or this big encounter with God. It can be the whole people of Israel, or it could be one or two people, and then they take a pile of rocks and they put them on the ground and they name it. And it becomes something, that place becomes a marker, a memory marker of this is the place where God did this thing. It's the same with us. You know, we establish those markers where God has worked in our lives. The main marker for all of us is the cross of Jesus Christ. God has delivered us from sin and death. That is what God has done. But for each individual one of us, there are times where we've had an answered prayer, or a time in our lives where God has gotten us through a difficult time, and we've come out on the other side and like, wow, God was there. Those are the times we need to make the marker. Write it in a journal. Keep a little something in a pocket, whatever it is. Because when we face those next giants, and they do come, those big challenges, we get strength and courage when we recall what God has done for us in the past. Gives us confidence that God will help us in our present. Because that's what David did. God helped me do this. God will help me do this. Now, the second thing that David did that kept him focused on God was motivation. You know, when Saul went to the men of Israel, he said, if you will go and defeat Goliath, I'll give you money, I'll give you my daughter, and I'll give you a tax-free life. It's a great deal, but there were no takers. And even David was given that option, and David said, I don't need that, because his motivation is found in verses 26 and 46. First, David is indignant. He cannot believe that an uncircumcised Philistine has the audacity to defy and insult the living God. And in verse 46, David says to Goliath, all those gathered here today will know that it is not by sword or by spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's. And he will give you all into my hands. And the whole world will know that there is a God in Israel. You see, David was fighting for the honor of God. He was fighting with the idea that God would be glorified through what he did. So, oftentimes we will pray every single week, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Or we'll pray a prayer, we'll add to the end of it in Jesus' name. Ultimately, we want our lives, we want our prayers to reflect the honor, the glory of our God. That others, the world around us, might come to know God through us. You know, how we face our challenges in life is always a witness to our faith and testifies to the power and presence of God in our lives. I've sat many times as a pastor with people who are in the process of dying, in a terminal situation, and their testimony of faith is incredible. There's no fear, there's no sadness. They are confident of who is with them through this. My friend Kelly, I've shared with you before, the quadriplegic. He hasn't walked since he was 19 years old. He's almost 60. He faces challenges every day of his life, but his faith in God is unstoppable. And then third is trust. David declared the victory before the battle was fought. He just says to Goliath, "Today the Lord will help me defeat you. I will knock you down, and I will feed your body and the body of the other Philistine soldiers to the birds and the wild animals." There is not 1 ounce of doubt in David's mind. He is confident in the Lord and trusts. As he says in verse 46, "For the battle is the Lord's." This story is not about David's triumph. It's a story of God's triumph and God's power revealed through David. So whatever the challenges that are going on in our lives, God is fighting for us. God is on our side, as it says on the bulletin. That is the message of the cross and of the resurrection. Paul, in his message to the Romans, says that nothing can separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus, because we are more than conquerors through him who loves us. And so for those of us who are facing those challenges in life that seem really big, we remember that if we focus on the challenge, it will freeze us up. It will paralyze us. We need to raise our eyes up. Focus on God. Remember the ways in which God has fought for us in the past and helped us in the past. Remember that the way we live our lives through the challenges brings honor to God and may bear witness and bring others into the faith of Christ, and trust that the battle is the Lord's. While we think about these things personally, I'm also going to challenge us to also think about these things as a corporate body as well, because it's a challenge to be a church in the 21st century. It's different than it used to be, reaching out into our communities, particularly Sundays. I mean, how many things were there? How many things could you do on a Sunday, 50 years ago? Not very many. So there's a lot of things out there. Churches are struggling, aging across the board. And so it's a challenge for us to find out, how do we reach into our communities? How do we make the church relevant? Because it is relevant. And so these same things apply. We can focus on our challenges. Oh, we can't do that. We're too old. Oh, we've never done it that way before. All the things we say, all the ways in which we focus in on what's hard and difficult and challenging. But again, it's paralyzing. We need to focus upward. To look at the ways that God has been with this church in the past and the ways that God is working in this church today. I love the Wrapped in Love ministry. The last time, remember when all those things were up here? There were over 200 items that went out, and Roxy's about to deliver another batch, and how many more are there now?
Oh, about 35 shawls, and there has to be close to 100 items.
Close to 100 more items since we blessed the last batch. People are just, and those are touching lives. We have our the healing prayer class. There's 14 members in the healing prayer class, and our Tuesday Bible studies, our grief support group. There are ways in which not everybody's from our church in the grief support group. About 5 different churches or people from different churches. And so God is working here. And so we need to focus not on the challenge, but where God is working, where God is calling us to do next, and how we can be motivated to share God's glory and honor that others might see and come. And the other is trusting. How many of you love your church? I hope you all love your church. Who loves your church more than you do? God. This is Christ's church. And I can guarantee you that Christ wants this church to survive. That Christ will fight a victory for us. But we need to step up, like David. You know, we have to do our part. Have courage and faith and trust. I love this quote from Joni Eareckson Tada on the front of the bulletin. That faith isn't the ability to believe long and far into the misty future. It is simply taking God at his word and taking the next step. That's what David did. And that's what we do individually, and that's what we do corporately as we step into the challenges we face. You know, in Acts chapter 13, verse 22, we're reminded that David was a man after God's own heart. That God saw David this way gives me hope, because David was both a saint and a sinner. You know, he rode the roller coaster of faithfulness. In his brightest moments, no one could be better. But in those dimmer moments, no one could be worse. As an adulterer and a murderer. David was devoted to God, and he worshiped God, and this was key. This is the key thing about David. When David's focus was on God, giants fell. When his focus was anything other than God, he fell. In today's passage, David succeeds. His thoughts were of God, and he mentions the Lord 9 times. He gives thought to Goliath twice. So giant 2, Lord 9. What is your God ratio? What is your God thought ratio? Do your thoughts of God's grace outnumber your thoughts of guilt? Is your list of blessings longer than your list of complaints? Is your file of hope thicker than your file of dread? And are you more likely to describe the strength of God, or are you focused on the demands of your day? It's questions to ponder. We all have challenges, and we need to step up and face them with a motivation toward revealing God to the world, with an attitude that God is bigger than any of our problems, and with confidence that God has given us the abilities we need to face them. James 11 says, if you believe in God, he will be there for you when you need him, and he will help you do things you usually aren't capable of doing. So let us believe. Thanks be to God. Amen. Let us now stand and join in the closing hymn.